I must say, it's very rarely I stand on the platform as the third speaker in a session to find that we're actually running on time. So I'm immensely grateful to my colleagues for doing that. I can't promise I will do the same, but I won't feel too guilty about it. I didn't realise until John Stafford spoke the reason why I'd been chosen for this session. Because his reminiscence of Minchell Street, which I didn't know was 200 yards down the road, was my very first engagement with probation in 1974, the same year that he started, though I'm afraid I don't remember John, I'm sure he doesn't remember me. I was a student training to be a teacher, but I'd read Illich, I'd read Free Area, I'd read A.S. Neil, and I decided teaching was indoctrination of the masses, so I couldn't do that. And I was looking around for a radical profession, and so I was sent to Minchell Street for a week to find out about this thing called probation service. And I think what's always stayed with me, and I'm afraid I can't remember the guy's name, although I think it was Campbell, who looked after me. He lived in a Catholic commune. And that couldn't have been much further away from my value base at the time. I was still calling myself a Marxist, I think, in those days. And as I spoke to probation staff in the office, you know, there were Salvation Army people, there were Methodists, there were Christians, there were Catholic commune people. There was a rich diversity of perspective in probation. And it felt as if it was a church that could hold lots of people in it. And I think that attracted me to it, and it was only a couple of years later when I started my journey in probation, when I started training, I became a probation volunteer in Hull, and 38 years on, I'm here talking to you today. I'm going to talk a little bit about change and continuity in probation, but I figured that given the speakers that we would have had by now, that most of the things one could say will have been touched upon. And thankfully, I've been ticking those off as I've gone through the afternoon. So I can allude briefly to a number of issues. What I felt I wanted to try and do was to look at the fact of the constancy of change in probation. It was mentioned by Heather and John earlier. And as I began to think about this, I began to brainstorm ideas on a paper. And I started with change and continuity. And then I went to constancy of change, and I became entirely stuck on the letter C. And I wrote 27 points down, all of which began with the letter C. So the entire lecture, will, as you will see unfold, will be dedicated to the letter C. Now, I did come across a storybooks kids thing called The Craziness of C. And I'd love to have played that to you. It's only 1 minute 41, but I didn't know whether we'd have the ability to do that. But you'll see that I've kind of shaped it so C remains important. So I start, and we started this morning, from court missionaries to court officer to court in disaster in the current climate. What characterises the past 25 years? And here, as I say, I'm going to continue this theme of letter C. And so I began to think, well, what is the collective noun for probation? And it's quite interesting when you start to look up about collective nouns. And we all know about all the animal ones that we play in quiz games. But what's the collective noun for probation, or collective noun for probation officers? Well, according to Google, there isn't one. So I thought I could make it my task to come up with a collective noun for probation over the past 25 years. Just to give you some sense of the absurdity of collective nouns, I did come across these examples. You have 3 professors speaking to you now. A collective noun for professors apparently is a pomposity of professors. This one I quite liked. The collective noun for corporate downsizing proposals is a hatchet. You may not like this one. The collective noun for managers is an indecision of managers. And of consultants, a prevarication of consultants. But just before I finish this exploration, I did just put in collective noun for grayling. And I amazingly came up with one. And apparently the collective noun for graylings is a festival of graylings. Well, I think it's more like a wake than a festival, but I think grayling is a somewhat inedible fish, but we'll leave it at that. Okay, so I've now messed up my thing. Sorry. Right. So, who decides on the right collective noun? So I'm going to try and construct a collective noun for 25 years of probation. Okay, my first of 8 that I'm going to try and use is this. A constructively critical culture of probation. 3 C's in that. Wonderful start. Now, I've long believed that this was one of the defining features of probation. And if both Rob and Anne have alluded to this facet. This comes really originally from Bill McWilliams, who talked about the objective being to create an organisational culture in which the official goals and the operational goals become one. This is far from easy, but is most likely to be achieved in a culture which places high emphasis on healthy and constructive criticism. And we see in references to this issue in the Bill McWilliams series. Peter Rayner said in 2012, instead of direction from the centre, we could try to build learning organisations. This is an important bit. The early days of What Works was fed by a culture of curiosity. It was a bottom-up initiative. It was fed, and it was started, a lot of it in Manchester in fact, when people began to look at their practice and began to examine it. And the early What Works conferences were an example of this constructively critical culture. Steve Collett said in the Bill McWilliams lecture of 2013, if probation is a morally significant activity, not simply reducible to the techniques of correction, it requires a competent, critical and reflective workforce. And I think that is at the essence of why probation is such an interesting and exciting organisation to be part of, but why it can be difficult for governments and civil servants trying to bring it to book and make it operate in a standardised way. We've just seen from some of Anne's comments that if you go for a one-size-fits-all organisation, you end up not meeting the needs of women and, of course, many other groups. I would say in passing that although this period of 25 years saw the demise of social work training, and Rob alluded to that, I think we shouldn't forget that we also created what was called at its time the Rolls-Royce of training, via the use of competences in MVQs, the development of probation consortia, which were very important, and the critical thinking that we tried to introduce in the DIPS qualification. I think the DIPS qualification was exceedingly exciting and represented the best of what we could do in relation to keeping that culture going. Unfortunately, the way the service moved made it more difficult to keep that. But I think if there's anything that is at the top of the agenda for a probation institute, it is to keep that constructively critical culture in the training of all staff, wherever they end up, be it MPS or CRCs. I want to move on now to my second contender for a collective noun. A compliance of probation. One of the things that's happened over the past 25 years is we've moved from advise, assist and befriend to enforce, rehabilitate and public protection. And some of that we're quite happy with, and we've already spoken about that quite a lot today. But I think it's made the probation service a different organisation. Care and control has always, another double C, has always been an important balancing act for probation. And I've lectured on that right back from 1982 onwards. One couldn't just churn out the same lecture, because that balance has changed in probation dramatically over the years. I think the development of public protection and risk management, which became key drivers of the probation service, moved it towards more control and more compliance features. But many of those things were for the good. But the centrality of compliance as enforcement and monitoring and surveillance became overemphasised, I would suggest, in the early 2000s. And what we've begun to see in the last few years is a little retrenchment from that, as we put a balance back into probation work. I think national standards, which started off as an educative document, a supportive document for practice when it was first produced in 1995, simply became a compliance manual. And it was very healthy to see it being put to one side as we experiment with offender engagement and the offender engagement program. So I think a compliance of probation would emphasise too much one aspect rather than both aspects of work. My third contender is a criminology of probation. Now, this is not the best word, I have to confess, but I wanted to keep it to C. This is really about the importance of evidence in practice, the rise of evidence, what I call evidence-informed policy. I think we go too far when we talk about evidence-based policy. I do not believe our practice is based entirely on evidence, because I think research has to work in the real world of practice, and practice is much messier than theory and research. But I think we should be informed by evidence, and that should be a particular clarion call. Now, I'm not going to go through the list of chronological research that has had impact in the last 25 years. We've touched on them already. Cognitive behavioural therapies, predator programs, risk needs responsibility, the development of desistance theories, which has been around for a long time, but I think the work that's been done in the last 10 or 15 years by Maruna and McNeil and others has been seminal in influencing probation practice. And it's felt to me like we've got answers to the questions we felt we knew intuitively about in the 1970s and 1980s, that it's given us a research base to support some of our thinking about practice. Restorative justice has been supported by criminological research and continues to develop, perhaps a little unevenly, in probation. Social inclusion was mentioned by Heather earlier. The offender engagement program was really important. It helped the rediscovery of things like relationships, pro-social modelling, motivational interviewing and case management, which were in danger of dropping out when we became a programme-led organisation in 2001 and 2002. All these things owe some legacy towards research and towards evidence. But crucially, it's been much more interactive than simply a top-down approach. I think probation has been at its best when it's been a bottom-up approach to change. I think we've got a good, if you like, or a bad example with the top-down approach that took place post-2001, when instead of a good idea being developed sensitively in local areas, the imposition of accredited programs was done in a way which was unhelpful. I think if we take practitioners into being researchers, we take the best of practice and we engage them. We saw two great examples before the break. My next example, I think it's the fourth, is a community of probation. Rob mentioned community justice and community engagement, which I've talked about over the last few years, community reintegration and resettlement. I think we've lost a little bit of our engagements in community. We've become too office-bound, as Rob talked about. I think the strengths of probation practice, probably prior to the 1990s, was in its relationship with the community. Although we've lost that community-based practice, I think we haven't lost in terms of our partnership development. And I think particularly since the Trust came into being, locally driven, with local partners, including at times very positive co-location, as Anne mentioned in relation to IOM and PPOs. The development of community safety partnerships, criminal justice boards, relationships with the courts, police, the voluntary sector and the private sector have all proved productive in keeping us involved in locally based and locally driven practice. So maybe all is not lost for community justice, which flowered so briefly at the turn of the century when John Harding was a particular commentator on this, but has gone perhaps quiet in recent years. It seems to me that if you want complementary services, it requires collaboration. IOM is the perfect example of that sort of collaboration. And I do worry that the new world will find itself too fragmented, too competitive, to be able to really pay attention to those sorts of collaborations. But I'm talking of the past, not the future. Okay, the next one, sixth I think, is what I call a co-production of probation. Now the notion of co-production has developed in recent years, and this means delivering public services in an equal and reciprocal relationship between professionals, people using the services, and their families and neighbours. It means working with people. And I think we've seen the beginnings of some very exciting activity in probation, particularly in the last few years. We've moved away a long time ago from client, we went to offender, which I think is always a particularly problematic phrase, to service user, to co-production. The triangulation of research, historical practices, and a growing user voice has moved from being done to doing with, and I think that can only improve our practices. The development of peer mentoring, again touched on by Anne, has been very important in this respect. But I think there's a danger that if it becomes picked up and used nearly as a political slogan, that we will find the concept not developing as it should. Peer mentoring is very difficult to set up. We're evaluating a project at the moment, and it takes a lot of support and management support for peer mentors to be able to carry forward their new role and new identity. And we should be careful that we don't try and roll it out in the way in which we did accredited programs. Restorative practices have gained some ground in probation. Redemption celebrations, I think, have become much more prominent. It is good to celebrate success, not only staff success, but certainly our clients' success. And things like circles of support and accountability and similar restorative practices are important to engaging alongside our service users in the work we do. I don't think we're quite there yet, but I think co-production would give us a lot of value in years to come. Now, I couldn't do this analysis without coming up with a collective noun for some of the things that has gone wrong over the last 25 years. So my next one, oh no, sorry, that's the one after that. Forget that sentence, I've got one in between. I've forgotten the order that I put them in. So this one is a cultural diversity of probation. And I knew that Anne would be talking in detail about women offenders, so I don't really intend to talk much more on that one. But certainly, this is extremely important as we move forward, that there isn't a one-size-fits-all to practice. Anne has eloquently talked about that in relation to women. We've seen lots of interesting work in recent years around domestic abuse and domestic violence. The work that Theo Gavrilides is doing with Greater London around race and probation has been very important. Some of the developments that are going on now places at the forefront of anti-discriminatory and anti-oppressive practices. And I worry without that focus whether direction towards more equal and equality of opportunity will be missed. I think probation has done well at setting its stall out to be as culturally diverse as possible, although it can always develop and improve its practice. So, to the downside of probation, and the collective noun that I've used for this is a calamity of probation. I think it would be wrong to review 25 years and just pretend that we've had a wonderful time. I can't think that anybody would want to just do that if we're being reflexive. And I think there have been some real problems in the past 25 years. There's been inconsistencies in practices which has held us up for analysis and debate, and unintended consequences of sometimes good ideas but not well put into practice. Centralisation, I think, has been a problem for probation. The National Probation Service Mark 1 in 2001, I think ultimately was a bad time for probation, and it's worrying that we're now moving towards MPS Mark 2. And NOMS, as people have already alluded to a bit quietly, but NOMS has not been wonderfully supportive to the development of probation practice. The commodification and marketisation of services particularly seen in prisons and now in probation, is a worrying development. Offenders are not commodities and shouldn't be treated as such. Contestability became an ugly word and disappeared, but was replaced by the simpler but no less difficult word of competition. Cost-cutting has been a feature that's been alluded to and made it very difficult for probation to continue to run itself efficiently. We've had crams, we've had C. nonis, which was an enormously expensive failure. We've had Oasis, we've had Delius. Not all of these have been unbounded successes. We've operated in a carceral society, a correctional focus, where penal populism and prisons have dominated the policy debates. And now we're in a period of contracted procurement and commissioning, not a great environment in which public sector work can go on. So I think there are those histories. I don't want to dwell on them because I don't want to depress us, but they are there, and we have to learn from some of the failures that have occurred as well as some of our successes. The next one, and I think this is the 8th, I've lost count now, and the final one is a communication probation. I chose this because I think we've tried in vain, I think, to persuade the public what probation is about. I said this quote, in a soundbite age, probation is not a soundbite organisation. And I don't think it should attempt to be so. I think it is very difficult to explain what probation is about to people. But that's because it's a very complex organisation, not because it can be done very simply. We've moved from the opportunity to be centre stage in 1991 to a real crisis of confidence in the work of the probation service. Communication departments proliferated in probation trusts, but didn't particularly change public perception. We tried customisation, branding, logos, repackaging of the work, but that also didn't particularly change public perceptions. And we're into, more recently, communication control, corporate silencing introduced during the TR debates, and the role of social media. And also we've had a period of what I call contested nomenclature. We've gone from clients to offenders to service users. Community service has gone from community service to community punishment to unpaid work to community payback. It's very interesting that whenever it's described on TV, it's described as community service. But yet we continue with these name changes. And of course there was the attempt once to rename the probation service. It was to be known as the Community Rehabilitation and Punishment Service. And as one of the first professors of probation studies, I became very worried because I was going to become a professor of crap. Fortunately, that went away, but I think there's a serious point behind this. That many attempts to get rid of the words that shape probation have failed. And that's because deep down, our service users know what probation is. In all the interviews we do with offenders on our research, they talk about being on probation. They don't talk about having a community order or being on integrated offender management. They talk about being on probation. When you talk to people in the public, they talk about probation. So even though probation orders don't exist, I think probation does have currency, and we should continue to support the use of that word. I think it describes something quite important and different. So, I've tried 8 ways of constructing a collective noun for probation, and I guess there's a little bit of all those features over the past 25 years. And if I pick up from what's been said already today, what I've said and what's been said by Rob and Anne, I think that at the end of the day, the thing that draws us all together is the creativity of probation. And so if I was to settle for a collective noun, I think the creative of probation has some ring to it, and I think if we started talking about it, maybe it would have some continuation. I think there's something very complex and difficult about describing probation, but I think one of the best attempts to get underneath that complexity, and I think one of the most seminal books published in the last few years was the book by Anne and Rob Morby. And I just quote this line because I think it describes perfectly some of the complexity, but some of the ability of probation to be creative and innovative. She describes 3 different types of probation officers: the lifers, the second careerists, and the offender management. And in doing so, she highlights the key elements that were key to their role and suggests that if you want a good probation officer, you should have a combination of all those elements. So the quote is, "Idealism, vocationalism and intellectualism of the lifer. Life experiences, transferable skills and commitment to making a difference of the second careerist. And victim empathy, concern for public protection and willingness to challenge offending behaviour of the offender management." And I think if you get probation trying to achieve all those elements, you end up with a very creative organisation indeed. So to summarise, what have we learnt about the last 25 years? We have had creditable success. We have external kite marks like the gold medal. We have reductions in reoffending documented over the past 7 or 8 years. And workers are happy in probation, or were happy in probation as an organisation. We have capability, huge capability now around rehabilitation. We know much more what we're doing. It's never been so extensive and evidence-informed. We are commissioners. We're good at commissioning. We create partnerships. We know what goes on in localities. We could work very well with PCCs to help better a commissioning process locally and pool in resources. We are comprehensive. Trusts are accountable. They're integrated with private and voluntary providers, and they're locally sensitive. And increasingly, I think, we have co-production. Bottom-up initiatives which could be extended with service users which demonstrate innovation and flexibility. We are, to put it simply, a creative organisation. And any look over the last 25 years, and certainly over the last 107 years, would confirm that probation passes the test of being an institution that should be preserved. I want to finish by really going back to where Rob started in his discussion when he talked about his commitment to probation. And I have a particular take on this that was helpfully developed for me by a friend and ex-probation colleague, Philip Proctor. And I'm sure it's something that will have resonance in this room. I recently attended a magician's event with Philip. And I volunteered to go on stage, rather foolishly really. And Philip was, if you knew Philip, he was a very good cartoonist, and he sat down and drew what was happening to me on stage. And what happened was, I was cut in half, and that was the end product. Then in the middle is probation. And I think if you cut most people in half in this room, that would be true. And I think that's an important statement of the importance of probation for all of us. So, despite the uncertainties of tomorrow, I think we can be very proud of the creative way in which we collectively tried to develop probation over the last 25 years. Thank you.